Hello and welcome to the Learning Expert interview series. My name's Kate Cobb. I'm director of blendedlearningzone.com, and I've been privileged to work with many companies over about 30 years, helping them to provide the training they need. Today our topic is informal learning, and my guest is Paul Matthews. Let me introduce Paul to you and then we'll hear from him. Paul is an expert on how organisations can use informal learning to improve their productivity and performance and to create a well-informed and motivated workforce. For over a decade, he's worked with major public and private sector organisations to support them with their management and leadership challenges. Paul's a regular speaker on the Leadership and Management Circuit, and he gives talks on harnessing the power of informal learning at industry events and exhibitions. He's also author of a very practical and interesting book called Informal Learning at Work, How to Boost Performance in Tough Times. Hello Paul and welcome.
Oh, hi. No, good to speak to you.
Thank you, and to you too. Thank you very much for agreeing to do the interview. I've got a few questions to go through which I think are the sort of things that learning professionals are going to want to have answers to. Firstly, one of the issues that I find with the learning methodology is that people are very confused about what different things mean. Certainly for me, people get very confused about what blended learning is. So I wondered if we could start off by putting you on the spot and asking you to come up with a definition of informal learning.
That's the learning that people are doing all the time, often without being aware of it, is one way to think of it. The other way is to split it or differentiate it from formal learning, which of course is happening in a classroom or some sort of scheduled or required e-learning program. So anything that's not scheduled, that's happening outside of a scheduled or planned event, you could call informal learning. And it actually accounts for the vast majority of the learning that we do as people in our lives and in the workplace.
Right. So if it's something that's going on all the time, it sounds like it's a bit outside the scope of the learning and development department.
Some people might say that. In actual fact, I disagree with that. I think that that's a change that's happening in learning and development at the moment, where I think the role of L&D needs to change. And I've had many discussions about this with people in learning and development departments, where I say you need to be thinking more about not learning as an outcome, even though your job title might be learning and development. You need to be thinking about what that learning is really designed to do. And if you go and talk to the senior business people in the organization, they will say, I'm not really fussed about learning. What I want is people who are capable of doing what needs to be done in order for the organization to be successful. So really, what I encourage people in learning departments to do is to start thinking of themselves as capability managers, in the sense that the only reason they are doing learning type interventions is to enable people to be capable and do the kind of jobs and tasks that the organization needs to be done in order to be successful at its vision or mission or whatever. And so therefore, if a lot of this learning is happening outside of the classroom, rather than sit on their hands and say, oh, woe is me, I can't, I can't affect a lot of the learning, I think quite the opposite is true, and that actually learning and development people have a massive role to play in all of the learning that's going on, including all the informal learning that's happening outside the classroom. I think one of the ratios that's been kicking around for a while, and there's some research backing for it, is 70-20-10. So some people may have heard of that. In a nutshell, it means that 70% of the learning that people do, or the stuff that they know in order to do their job, they learn on themselves or through observation or experience. Around 20% of what they know in order to do their job, they learn from colleagues. So this is sort of social interactions, coffee machine conversations, those sorts of things, networking. And only about 10% of what people know in order to do their job happens in a classroom or in some kind of formal scheduled learning intervention. Now that ratio is not a recipe, it's not something that you should aspire to, and some jobs that ratio will vary quite a lot, although it's always very heavily biased towards informal learning. And that informal learning it's happening anyway. It's the way that we've always learnt, long before we ever had classrooms. So I think that's the important thing. And really the learning and development person's role is more to facilitate the learning landscape that exists around people in an organisation, so that that informal learning is working well and people are able to learn what they need to learn to do their jobs. So that probably defines informal learning a bit better, and I think that also means that the learning and development role is, in my mind, expanding hugely now into this area of making sure that people are capable, which obviously has bigger ramifications than just learning, because there's other things that are involved with capability beyond what people know how to do.
I agree with you totally that the L&D role is changing, and has to change, and people have to change with it, but I find some of the managers that I work with that change is somewhat daunting. They're a bit concerned about their role expanding. What would you say that L&D professionals need to know about informal learning? What do they need to learn about it? How can they take action to include it more within their role?
I think there's a few mindset shifts that are needed. One is to realize that learning does happen outside the classroom, and many learning and development people they might say they know that, but actually they don't behave as though that's true. So it is about getting that knowledge that learning is really ubiquitous, that it's happening all over the place. And it's really simple things that actually people don't often know that they're learning. There's a lack of awareness of when learning is taking place, both by the learning and development people themselves and by the people in the workplace doing the learning. Here's a very simple little example. If you go to the supermarket, and in the wisdom of the supermarket, they've changed where the cans of baked beans are, and you want some baked beans. You hunt around and you find them in a different aisle. You go to the checkout, you pay for your shopping, and you come outside the supermarket. If at that point I asked you, what have you learned? You'd probably look at me like I'd fallen off a spaceship. What you have actually learned is where those baked beans now are. And next time you go back to the supermarket, if you want baked beans, you'll go straight to that aisle. So you learned something, you modified your behavior as a result, you retained that knowledge, and you'd modify your behavior in the future, again, as a result of that learning. So that's learning by any definition, and yet nobody, while that was happening, was trying to cause learning, and the people doing the learning, you in the supermarket, weren't aware that you were even learning. And I think that's one of the important things, is to understand how ubiquitous learning is in the workplace and in life. And in fact, a huge amount of learning is a side effect of life. It just happens as we live, just simply because we're being aware of what we're doing. So that's one way that we learn, is what you might call task-conscious learning, where if we're conscious of what we're doing, we're kind of paying attention to what we're doing. We're not seeking to learn, but just the fact that we're aware of what we're doing, we're aware of the results we're getting, our unconscious mind will tend to direct us towards getting better results from what we're doing. So we will, sort of by default, we'll learn. The other end of the spectrum is where we're absolutely consciously seeking to acquire learning, which is sort of, you might call, acquisitive learning. So there's this continuum between learning that's virtually out of our awareness and just happens because we're conscious of what we're doing. And people like Alan Rogers have defined this as task-conscious learning. And then the other end of that spectrum is learning-conscious learning, where we are actually out to learn. Even if learning isn't the primary outcome of the activity we're doing, it's one of the outcomes. It's perhaps something that we're seeking to know more about. So I think that's the first thing that learning and development people need to get, is that learning is ubiquitous. It's happening out there. It's not just happening as a result of learning and development people doing something, it's happening anyway. So that's the first step. And then I think the second step is about making the managers in the organization much more aware of that as well. So it's teaching the managers about things like the 70-20-10 ratio and saying, actually, as a manager or a team leader, you have more power over what your people around you learn than anybody else. The team supervisor has a superpower, if you like. They actually have more influence over how much and how well and what their people learn than anybody else. Even if they send them away to a training course somewhere, how that manager acts and behaves prior to the training course, how they set it up for that team member to go to, and then how they interact with that team member when they get back, all has a massive effect on how well that training course actually works and how much of the knowledge from the training course is transferred back to the workplace. So that team supervisor or manager has this superpower, if you like, of influencing learning for themselves and their team, their immediate environment. And actually, here's a way. If they've been given a superpower, they've been given a billowing cape and some shiny underpants. Actually, it's a moral crime not to use that superpower for the greater good. So I think there's a need for those managers to become aware of how big their influence is on the learning that's happening around them. And then step 3 is for the learning and development person to go to those managers and say, you are the biggest influence on the learning landscape that's happening around you and for your team. How do we help you make that a positive influence? What things can learning and development do to aid you to facilitate that learning environment so it's a positive environment for your team? And then learning and development is going to get involved to some extent in formal training, because that's certainly a part of that learning environment, but also involved in things like performance support and so on. So there's a lot more to it. The role of L&D has got to change. It's got to go out there into the workplace and be operable in the workplace much more than it has been in the past, where they've been restricting themselves to some extent to the classroom.
Excellent. I like very much those 3 steps, the 3 points that you made, and particularly the emphasis, or trying to reinforce the emphasis on the role of the manager. Managers have always been so influential, but it's not always been brought home to them, I think, and I absolutely agree with you what you're saying about making managers more aware of what's going on. And obviously in terms of the company or any corporation, any organisation, they're concerned now about bottom line business benefits. So how do you think, if we're able to make the mindset shifts as L&D people and actually use the whole world of informal learning much more as part of our learning within organisations, how's that going to help the business achieve its success, achieve its objectives?
Well, yeah, this question of is informal learning, how do we make it help the organisation? It already is, because the vast majority of the bottom line results of any organisation are already there because informal learning is taking place, because people have learnt the majority of what they know how to do in order to do their jobs. That's already happening through informal learning. And what we can do is leverage that informal learning so they actually know how to do their jobs better. We can help them raise their competence, raise their capability by facilitating and encouraging and harnessing that informal learning. What I always hesitate to use the word manage it, because what I have seen in companies is where they start to try and manage that, in effect they start making it more formal and they kill the very power that makes it powerful. Is they remove the informal aspects from it by trying to formalize it and manage it. So it is all about setting up an environment where learning can happen more effectively and better and more easily for the people in that environment. And that might be things like for example, a job that requires you to access some information on an intranet, if that information is really hard to get to, because it's hundreds of clicks or not easy to find, there's barriers between the users and the informations that they need. Systems and processes, if those cause barriers to people doing their jobs, if spare parts or tools are not available. So all of these things are part and parcel of whether someone's capable in the moment of doing a job. And capability you can think of is if there's a task in front of someone, can that person respond to that task sufficiently to get the task done? Mm-hmm. And that's what capability is the ability to respond in a way that's totally appropriate to that task. Not necessarily more, because that'll not help them do it any better. And if they can't respond adequately, then of course the task won't get done or won't get done well. Either way, it's not good for the organization. So how can you assist them in the moment to be capable of performing that task? And this is things like performance support and things like informal learning. What do they need to learn in the moment to be able to continue with that task and get it done? So I think that's where the organization needs to be thinking about stuff, is verging more on that performance support aspect, because a lot of performance support involves informal learning. But if you call it performance support, that'll actually play better to the budget holders of the organization, because they understand what performance is about. They don't necessarily place a huge amount of value on learning. Mm-hmm. So if you say to them, my job as a learning and development person is actually really, I'm a capability manager. My job is to ensure you've got people who are capable of doing in the moment what they need to do, and that they can perform adequately. With a bit of luck, we can get them perform even better than adequately. But it's about performance and capability. And if you go to a senior finance director and say, my job is about making sure people are capable and performing well, you'll get your money to do development work and performance support with those people. If you go to a finance director and say, I want to teach these people lots of stuff so they learn lots, that sounds pretty fuzzy. There isn't really a clear line of sight between that outcome and the bottom line results of the organization. Whereas if you're talking about capability and performance, there's a much clearer line of sight between those words and the organization meeting its outcomes and goals. So that's this link between the organization and performance support and informal learning. Does that make sense?
Certainly does. It's very interesting, Paul. I'm just thinking on the issue of budgets. People are always concerned about how much sorts of things are going to cost. Now, it's clear from what you're saying that informal learning is not like paying tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars to set up and commission someone to produce an e-learning system. We're talking about something that's quite different here. But would you say that there are costs associated with not trying to formalise informal learning too much? Because I accept what you say, then you lose the power of it. But would you say that there are costs involved here?
There's absolutely costs involved. Any kind of initiative is going to have some costs, even if it's simply labour costs internally, because someone's got to do something. Now, those costs for many things that enhance the informal learning environment, or learnscape is one term I've used for it, actually are often far, far less expensive than training courses. And of course, the more spread out geographically a company is, the more travel involved with training, all of those sorts of things can make formal training courses very, very expensive. So informal or initiatives that assist informal learning to happen at the right time, at the right place, are often very much less expensive than the formal interventions. And usually they're far more effective. It does depend how they're done. You do have to do them in a way that's sensitive to how the culture is for the organization and a lot of other factors. That's one thing in my book is somebody must have counted. They said that there's over 50 ideas on how to put informal learning stuff into an organization. I must confess I never counted myself, so I'm glad they did. But that whole purpose of that book was to bring up and put in place lots and lots of different ideas of ways that you can put in both high-tech and low-tech systems to encourage informal learning in the right time and the right place. But yes, there are costs, and some companies put in massively big systems like internal social media systems and so on, and they actually spend quite a lot on software. But you will always have an implementation cost in terms of time and effort and encouraging people to use it. And always you'll get some things that will work better than others, so you'll go back to the drawing board for some of the things that you do, inevitably, because it's not an exact science.
Cool. So, I mean, looking through your book, I think the thing that made it most useful to me, I think, is how practical it is. That it's very much about practical solutions, ideas, easy ways of thinking through this issue, which is sometimes a bit complex and complicated. Some people I know in learning and development get overwhelmed totally by the idea of looking at all these so-called new learning methodologies. Tell us about how people can get hold of your book.
Well, they can get it from Amazon. It's probably the easiest place to grab it, and it's also available off our own website at www.peoplealchemy.co.uk. So there's some links on there to get it. Either way, it's fine by us, and I think it's a useful book. It's great. Just the other day, we had a review done by Peter Honey. Some of your listeners may know of him from the Honey and Mumford learning styles. So he's sort of a grandfather of learning, and certainly in the UK and in other places around the world. And I was lucky enough to bump into him at a seminar I was at, and he offered to review my book, and he's done a wonderful review of it. So I was really chuffed with that. So I think the book itself seems to have hit the spot for people who want practical ways to move forward with figuring out how L&D is changing, because there's some chapters in there on that, and then what they can do at a practical level to encourage and improve the capability of the people in their organizations through informal learning interventions. In fact, the last line in the book is, it's all about capability. And then the next book is already sort of underway in terms of capability at work, because I think that's really where, to use that expression, the rubber hits the road. That's really where it counts, is, are people capable?
Right, absolutely. Well, I highly recommend the book Informal Learning at Work, How to Boost Performance in Tough Times. And obviously you work with companies on the issue of informal learning as well as other things, I know, but informal learning particularly. If people want to contact you to talk about how you might help them, do they go through your website? What's the best way?
They can find me on the website and or my LinkedIn profile. If they just stick People Alchemy into Google, they'll find us very, very quickly. So we're easy to track down. And I do love having conversations about informal learning, about capability, about how the workplace is changing, and also how learning and development can get more senior buy-in. Because I think in a lot of organizations I see that learning and development people aren't really getting the kind of reverence, I guess, from the senior management team. And I think this is a historical thing where over time learning and development people or training managers have put forward training as being the ultimate performance resource solution. In other words, if there's a performance problem, they've kind of sold senior people on the idea that training is the solution. So over many years that's happened. However, the results from training in most cases are disappointing. Some training courses work extremely well, but many just don't. And a lot of people are quite disillusioned with the results that training get, but aren't aware there's really much else that can be done. So they keep going back to get more training, thinking, well, there must have been something wrong with that training or that provider or that system or the number of days or something like that. So they can try and get better results than they have been getting. And I think now there's a need for training people to step up to this bigger remit and actually become experts, But in order to do that, they've got to go to the people on the board and talk board language. They have to start talking about vision and mission and the organizational strategies in the same language the board members are using, so they can get actually taken seriously by the board members. And I think that's something that I'm certainly seeing some are doing, but many still in learning and development need to step up to that new way of doing things and that new relationship they need to have with their senior operations people.
That's amazing you're saying that, because just yesterday I conducted a webinar on that very topic of how to get buy-in, how to get yourself heard at the top table, as I call it, with L&D people. So absolutely, couldn't agree more with you what you're saying there. Just perhaps as a last question, because we probably need to finish, in terms of informal learning, is there a way that you could suggest learning and development professionals get more support from senior managers?
I had a discussion a couple of days ago with, about a week ago now actually, so very recently, with a very senior learning and development person from a large pharmaceutical company. And he was bemoaning the fact that he had been sidetracked, in his opinion, onto this risk assessment project. They were doing some restructuring and he'd been asked to assess the risk of this restructure. And he said, before I even did this project, I knew what the answer would be. It would be the risk is the knowledge walking out the door, when some of our senior people take a package and leave the organization. I predicted that result. That's the result I get as being the biggest risk that senior managers saw in this reorganization that was going on. So he presented his findings and he said, I'm glad that's off my plate. And then he asked me, how do I convince those senior people to get involved with informal learning initiatives? Because he'd read my book and he said, this is great. There's lots of things here I'd love to do. But where do I go from here? How do I get buy-in from these senior people about this informal learning stuff? And I said, what you need to do is take the results of that risk management thing you've just done back to them. Because you see, if they see knowledge walking out the door with senior people as a primary risk to this restructure, then clearly it's not a risk if they can train people with that same knowledge, because that just means they've got to run some training courses and they just train the people who are left with the same things. So in other words, there is no risk if you can train people on the knowledge that's walking out the door. So clearly they're agreeing that you cannot train people on this knowledge. In other words, the knowledge that they're scared of losing is knowledge that's been learned outside the classroom in an informal fashion. It's experiential knowledge. And so they already are bought into the fact that informal learning is a vital part of what makes their organization work. And so you don't have a sales pitch to make to convince them that informal learning is essential. You've just got to point to the results of your survey.
That's a very good example.
Interesting that he connected all those dots together.
No. And it sounds that what you're saying in kind of general terms, we've got to start connecting the dots a lot more as learning development professionals. Yeah,
and those dots need to be the dots that the senior team, the top table as you call it, are working with. It's not about them understanding learning and development jargon and what you're doing in your learning and development area. It's about you stepping up to that top table and presenting to them in their language and their way with terms they understand, which is all about bottom line results, shareholders, or in the public sector, constituents or patients or whatever it happens to be. So really what matters to the organization, what's its strategy, where's it going, and how does learning and development support that and make it possible? You need to be the trusted advisor on how well the vehicle of the company or organization is equipped to take the journey that the senior table wants to take that vehicle on. You're the mechanic. You can say, yes, your vehicle needs fixing in order to make it capable of undertaking this journey. And you need to be that trusted mechanic who knows what the organization is capable of and what it's not capable of what it needs to be capable of in order to undertake this journey that the senior table wants to take it on, and then what has to happen in order to get that capability in place.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. It's a good place for us to finish, I think.
Yep.
5 words there to learning and development professionals. Thank you very much for giving us the time today for a very, very interesting contribution. Now we know where to go when we want to know anything about informal learning. So thank you very much, Paul. And I hope people listening will be joining me again soon for another Learning Expert interview.